to make it possible for me to find my way to Ljubljana, which was one of the nicest things I had done in many, many years. It's a wonderful place to be. And it's a wonderful conference as well, and I look forward to the presentations to follow, as well as thank the people who've spoken already. So who likes ebooks? If I were to ask this question in the United States, I would get some very grim looks. What right do I have to ask the question? You know, everybody likes ebooks. Maybe. I'd like to begin with a kind of point-counterpoint, looking at some of the things that people say are really terrific. I think we want it's all right? No. You want the lights? You can vote. All right, I'll let you all decide. I'll just keep speaking. We'll look at some of the attitudes of people saying, don't be silly, print is dead, as opposed to, don't be silly, print will stay. So what I'm speaking from is very much an American perspective. I do have some cross-cultural data I'll be speaking about later, but let me start with things that are vintage USA. Ben Horowitz, venture capitalist, with Mark Andreessen, some of you know from Mosaic fame. Ben Horowitz said about a year ago, babies born today will probably never read anything in print. We'll see what the statistics say about some of those babies born today, who don't read yet, but have people reading to them. Counterpoint. This is from a student of mine, in a class on language of the new millennium 2 years ago. She wrote in her journal, based on the readings that we were doing, in talking about digital media. And she was probably at that point talking about reading on a laptop. It's not a book. It doesn't have a smell. You don't touch it. You're plugged into the internet. You can't concentrate. It hurts your eyes. And you lose the beauty of the words behind the screen. Life itself is in hard copy, not the treacherous digitalism which has permeated our lives and our reality. In looking at some of the reports from various countries that you all have prepared, it's very gratifying to see some of these same words being voiced by students in other parts of the world about smell and touch and concentration and your eyes and beauty. Another point. So what's the one thing you like most about reading on screen? I'll talk about the studies that I've done over the last 3 years. Core of the questions I've asked each time have been, what is the one thing you like most about reading on the screen? What's the one thing you like least? What's the one thing you like most about reading in hard copy? What is the one thing you like least? So this is one of the responses of what I like most about reading on the screen. In this case, it was an undergraduate 2 years ago. The ability to travel and bring multiple books to read, but you don't have to fill up your suitcase. That sounds very familiar in terms of that convenience factor that many of us have discovered readers have in many cases. Counterpoint. This is a quote from The Guardian. It was from 2007, which is just before, the Kindle came out in December 2007. So this comment was made before e-readers were really popularized. I wonder if anyone has ever cried reading an e-book. And I'd like us to think about emotion and what kinds of emotion print may generate as opposed to reading something on a digital screen, especially a small one. Okay, some defining parameters. What I mean by e-reading is reading on any digitally accessed text. So it could be on a computer screen such as this, it could be on a PC, it could be on a mobile phone, it could be on a tablet, it could be on an e-reader. When I'm talking about ebooks today, what I really have in mind is a book-length something that's in digital form. So it could be in PDF, it could be in HTML5, it could be in EPUB 3 or whatever. and that you read as continuous text. So I'm not talking about web pages, I'm not talking about blogs, although some of them are long. I'm also not really going to be talking about digitally native books that are designed for the purpose of taking advantage of all of those affordances that digital technologies have. Those books are too new for us to really make any judgments on how people read them and how they read different genres on them. Rather, what I'll be talking about today is continuous digital text that you access on some digital device. I just listed them. Okay. The rise of e-reading. So let's think a little bit about how long we have been reading on digital devices. And I'm going to put aside computers, because depending on the country, we may have been reading on them for differing lengths of time, but specifically look at what we call today e-readers. There were some precedents in the late 1990s, but more seriously, at least in the United States, we started thinking about e-reading around 2004 with the Sony e-reader. It came out a little earlier in Japan, but it did not take off. It was too cumbersome, it was too much of a strain on the eyes and so forth. It was the Amazon Kindle that, as we know, changed the notion of what it meant to read. It changed the notion that reading is that which you can do on a digital screen, and a digital screen you can bring with you. And at that point, the original Kindle, in essence, had no internet connection except for getting you books to download. The iPad came out a couple of years later, and if you look at the statistics, at least in the United States, you know today, in fact, these are data from about a month ago, from about 2 weeks ago, excuse me, the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which tracks a lot of these issues in the United States, reports that roughly 24–25% of Americans age 16 and over have an e-reader, and something closer to 35% have some kind of a tablet. And e-reader sales are falling compared with what was projected, and tablet sales are going up. But since both of them, outside of a few, like some versions of Kobo and some versions of Kindle, such as Kindle Paperwhite, they have internet connection. In essence, they're a version of tablets anyway. We also know there are lots of smartphones, at least over 1 billion. So, my real question about e-reading is precedented upon the issue of, is there an internet connection? Because the notion of what it means to read when there are things that can distract you is totally different. Distract you digitally is totally different from the kinds of distractions we have with print. I think also the size of the screen real estate turns out to be important, although maybe not as important as we thought it was. And then I've already talked about changes in sales. Laptop sales, as we know, are going down. Tablet sales are going up internationally. So today's questions. What do we mean by reading? If we're going to talk about e-reading, we have to know what we mean by reading. What are the affordances of e-reading platforms? I'm looking at an audience that knows at least as much, if not more, about this than I, but I'll give you my set of possibilities. What are the challenges of digital reading? Again, a lot of you have done some really interesting research on these issues. I look forward to our conversations. What do writers and readers say about reading on screens? And here I think we can learn an enormous amount. At least in the United States, there have been a lot of assumptions coming from the media, coming from business, about the future of print, not alike. The future of digital, up. But then you actually ask people what they think as readers or as writers, and they tell you very different things from what commercial enterprises will tell you. And then my real question is going to be towards the end, how do we reconcile digital and print reading? All right, so what do we mean by reading? The first distinction I'd like to make is between what I call continuous reading and reading on the prowl. Okay, continuous reading meaning, well, it can mean a couple of different things. One distinction is, are you reading intensively, which typically means reading slowly, rereading, Or are you reading extensively? You read one thing, you finish it, you go on to the next, you usually don't go back to what you read before. If you look historically, you'll see with the rise of print culture, which we can put somewhere in the 18th century, with the rise of the novel, which we can put in the middle of the 18th century, there was a shift from intensive reading. You owned a small number of books. If you owned books at all, you probably owned the Bible, where you read the same thing over and again, as opposed to plowing through one thing after another. Okay, talking about plowing through, a distinction to be made for continuous reading, meaning reading linearly in a text from page to page, between the kind of thing that you can read fairly quickly, you don't have to concentrate on. Think about when you took your last plane ride and you didn't really care what you were reading, particularly as long as it occupied you, as opposed to reading something serious. And I just took as an example James Joyce. Okay, that's continuous reading. Contrast that with what I call reading on the prowl. So we can talk about skimming. So we skim in print when we're going to a bookshop or going to a library and saying, well, do I want to buy this or not? Do I want to check it out? Do I want to take it? Or a magazine in a doctor's office. On the screen, there's a version of skimming having to do with how we read web pages. Most of the people here know about Jakob Nielsen's work, suggesting that there is what he calls an F pattern in reading web pages, where you chug along and you read that first line, and then you read some of the second and a little less, and by the time you get to the bottom, you're seeing nothing on the lower right-hand corner. He and Don Norman now have a wonderful business teaching people how to write web pages so that people will read the parts that they most want to have read, because don't try the lower right-hand corner. Okay, scanning. We know how to scan in print. We do that often by using indices, if they still exist, and they do in print books, thank you, generally speaking. But on screen, there are a whole number of ways in which we are really scanning texts rather than reading them. There was a wonderful study that I'm sure many of you know, done by University College London a couple of years ago, where it said people go online not to read. And the study was done of academics. This is problematic. They came up with the phrase power browsing as a way of describing the way that academics, both faculty and I think it was graduate students, were approaching text. They weren't really reading. We all know about the find function, how wonderful it is. You can just zero in on a word or a phrase. You don't have to read anything else. My students used to get really angry with me when I would take an article that was in a journal my university did not have a digital subscription to. So I would religiously scan them and post them, but if you scan the text in, you can't use the find function. So my students would say, Professor Baron, could you please give us the real version of the article? I didn't know what they were talking about. You know, the real one, the digital one? And I thought, well, this is digitized. No. They didn't want to have to read the whole piece. They wanted to be able to take the words that I was suggesting were important, use the find function, read maybe those 2 lines, maybe a paragraph if I were lucky, and then they're done. Okay, there's also a growing notion, particularly in the United States, that what matters most is that you know how to do a really smart search. Not that you know anything. Sorry. You know how to scan. That's what you know how to search. That's what you know how to do. Dan Russell at Google has this notion of informacy. You know, it used to be computer literacy or digital literacy. Now there's informacy. That skill which we should develop is knowing how to search to find things online. Interesting notion of reading. Okay, another way of dividing up ways of thinking about reading is between so-called deep reading and so-called hyper reading. Marianne Wolf, who's a reading specialist at Tufts University outside Boston, has this definition of deep reading. Sophisticated processes that propel comprehension and that include referential and deductive reasoning. I have to breathe just to keep going. Analogical skills, critical analysis, reflection, and insight. In literature, you call this kind of reading close reading, meaning you carefully look at the text. This is opposed to what Professor of Literature Catherine Hales calls hyper reading. Sort of think of hyper-attention, hyperactive, you'll be on track. So what's hyper reading? A strategic response to an information-intensive environment aiming to conserve attention by quickly identifying relevant information so that only relatively few portions of a given text are actually read. So reading may be a conundrum there because you're reading bits and snatches. It's what I've called sometimes snippet literacy. You read a little piece and that's all you need to find, assuming the rest of the context isn't necessary to really understand what that piece is, presumably, you're focusing on. So we have two diametrically opposed notions of reading. The first, deep reading, which clearly predates digital reading and may be in contradiction with digital reading, and hyper reading, which absolutely is simpatico with digital reading. Okay, some of the affordances of reading on e-platforms. These will look obvious. Search functions, rapid switching between web pages, rapid switching between functionalities. You can reference materials, you can adjust the screen size and the font. All of this sounds highly familiar. Challenges. And some of these will sound highly familiar as well. What I'm suggesting, so let me give my sort of bottom line, is that the ways in which digital screens are leading us to read, and leading younger and younger generations to read, are shifting the notions of what it means to read. And I'll even be an agnostic here and say I'm not going to say good or bad, I'm just going to say the notion of what we mean by the reading process is being changed by the technology. Okay, so power browsing, not continuous reading. Hyper reading, not deep reading. Short, not long texts, and I was really gratified to see the results of a lot of the studies that you have collected data for that are absolutely consonant with my findings, namely short text, I can do it online. Long text, I want to see a hard copy. Okay, distraction and multitasking. I'll give you some data from my own studies in a moment on those. What I call one-off reading. Read things once, don't reread. And I think the technologies are very much leading us to one-off reading to the extent we are reading on screens. Little annotation, and some of that has to do with the sophistication of the tools. I suspect that will change with time. Little personalization of the text. There are ways of making a text yours, a book yours, that really don't exist digitally. And that notion of what a book is and what its relationship to you over time is, particularly if you keep it, changes with digital screens. I don't know what the case is in other parts of the world. I'd love to get data from you. In the United States, an incredible number of students are renting their books. They're renting them as hard copy. They're renting them as e-books, which means at the end of the term, they don't have it anymore. It's not part of their lives. They don't come back to it. Okay. We'll talk a little bit later about social approaches to reading as opposed to individual approaches. And I think that's another shift that's coming about with digital reading, given all the social reading platforms that are now developing, as well as writing losing its physical attributes, which a lot of you know a lot about. Okay, who benefits from ebooks? One of the lessons that's very important to keep in mind is that ebooks are a business. There's an organization called Digital Book World in the United States that tries to track and promote sales of ebooks. And there are lots of companies like the Book Industry Study Group that track and promote ebooks. And I get emails from them on a listserv 5 times a week, and it's amazing how industry is teaching us what we should like and what we should want to do. So one of my favorite conferences from the Book Industry Study Group was on, this is the title of it, Making Information Pay in Higher Education. Okay. Amazon sells roughly 50% of the books that are sold in the United States, whether that's print or whether that's ebooks. It's natural because they began as a print distributor, now a print publisher, to expand to ebooks. It's clear that there are a lot of people saying either I want both versions or I'm not sure which version I want, the print or the electronic. So there are a number of initiatives, one of them coming from Amazon right now called Matchbook, where for a little bit of money you can get both the digital and the print print version of the same book. If I were gazing into a crystal ball, I would say this would be a big growth area in the future. Roughly 25% of the books sold in the United States now are e-books. My publishers convinced me that it's only about 15% of dollar sales because the e-books generally cost less. We'll see where the future goes. Okay, the economics of e-books in education. This is a world I live in. So what has happened? Textbooks have become incredibly expensive in the United States. It depends on the school you go to and so forth, but the average cost if you buy new books for a year is somewhere around $1,200 US a year, which is quite a lot of money, thank you. Okay, so what's happened is different parts of the United States encountered economic challenges earlier than others, so we have this Great Recession. It started in some ways, even before the housing bust in the United States generally, in the state of California. They had a lot of problems. Arnold Schwarzenegger, in addition to being some version of an actor, really was governor of California. And he came up with this idea that because there was no money for textbooks in public schools, meaning sort of kindergarten through high school, that he was going to switch at least some students to open access ebooks. So they'd be free, students would still learn. It didn't go very far. What has happened in higher education is, again, there are people saying textbooks are too expensive, and if they're too expensive, the students are not buying them. You look at the statistics on what proportion of books do people acquire for college courses, and it's smaller than you'd like to believe. Students try to check them out in the library, they get used books, or they do not get them at all. They don't buy them. So Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, started an initiative roughly 5 years ago to do really hard negotiations with publishers to get lowered prices on ebooks. So, you know, if a book costs $100 in US in hard copy and $60 for the ebook, they would negotiate about $20 because they had everybody who would buy them, as opposed to it's assigned but I don't buy it. There are other organizations. There was one called Internet 2 within the United States, which gathers together a lot of universities to do interesting things, usually for high-performance computing of various sorts, an organization called EDUCAUSE. So there are many organizations within the United States that are trying to push ebooks for financial reasons. It's strictly financial. Okay, we've talked about the fact not everybody buys ebooks. Not everybody buys books, period. They rent them sometimes. There are some publishers. CourseSmart is one of the larger ones that now has subscription services, so you pay $200 and you can get up to 6 books. Okay, that's a great deal. At the end of the term, it's gone. There's a big move to open source textbooks as a way of saving money. And there's an enormous growth of online courses in the United States, which, surprise, surprise, generally have ebooks as their texts. Okay, some attitudes of writers, and I'll just give 2 examples. I'm sure there are many others you can find in other parts of the world. This is from Michael Durda, who's a book critic for the Washington Post. He wrote, "Ebooks resemble motel rooms, bland and efficient. Books are home, real physical things you can love and cherish and make your own till death do you part, or till you run out of shelf space." Some of us understand that. Paul Thoreau, the travel writer, with e-readers, something certainly is lost. The physicality of a book. How one makes a book one's own by reading it, scribbling in it, dog-earing pages, spilling coffee on it, living with it as an object, sometimes a talisman. Okay, so these are professional writers. They're not 18 or 20 years old. And you say, well, that's a different generation, right? Okay, well, first we're a couple of writers, and then I'll come to what? Okay, Alain de Botton. I found that whenever I read on my Kindle, I can't really remember in the long term. And I looked at a number of the studies that you all have done, and your students are saying, I don't remember it as much. It was as if I never read it. I know I forget some of the things I read in hard copy, but I can pick it up again if I really want to. Or my favorite is Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer, who said there's no future for ebooks because they're not books. And ebooks smell like burned fuel. Okay, you look at attitudes of parents as to what they want to read to their children, and children themselves, children going up to teenagers. And the people doing the studies were ones who wanted to find that digital reading was just on the ascendancy. So I'll just give you a couple of the statistics. This is from a study that was probably done in late 2012, published in 2013. Understanding the children book consumer, yes, this is business, in the digital age. So 69% of parents preferred print for their very young children from newborn to 6. 61% preferred print for children aged 7 to 19. Okay? The American Academy of Pediatrics has been arguing for years that screens in general are not things that very young children should be exposed to for long periods of time. They came out with another declaration about a year ago saying you really need to restrict the screen time, particularly for children under 2. On the other hand, you look at what publishers are pushing, it's books for very young children. It's apps on iPads where you swipe and you swipe and you swipe. Okay. In Silicon Valley, where everybody should really care about digital technologies, yes? Many of the parents send their children to what are known as Waldorf schools, which were founded a number of years ago by a man named Rudolf Waldorf. And let's just say they do not have these technologies. You use paper and pen or pencil, you knit, you do various things in these schools. And one of the executives was asked, so why do you do this? And he said, if I worked at Miramax, the film company, and made good artsy, rated R movies, I wouldn't want my kids to see them until they're 17. That is, people who work in the industry are often saying, this is not what I want my children to be exposed to now. Why are they saying this? Okay, reader attitudes. Scholastic, which is a publisher largely for kindergarten through high school, did a study and said for 6 to 8, 17-year-olds, 80% preferred print when reading for fun. Well, these are the ones who are supposed to like things digital, right? 58% said they will always want to read books printed on paper, even though there are ebooks available. This was 9 to 17-year-olds. Okay, study done by this group that had the conference, Understanding the Children's Book Consumer, said there was a growth in adolescence, number of adolescents over about the last 3 or 4 years of people who wanted to read ebooks. And then suddenly, particularly teenage girls who do much more reading in the States than teenage boys were wanting to read print more. So the description was there's this snap back to print. Well, that means we're not selling ebooks, right? That happened recently. I haven't seen 2013 figures. I'm going to see if they're available. I'll let you know. Okay, so what studies have I done? I wanted to ask, what do readers think? What do readers who are in the millennial generation, what do readers who at this point almost all have smartphones, they have laptops definitely, a growing number have tablets or e-readers. And I did 3 versions of the study over a period of time. I've already told you about my 4 favorite questions, and then I had lots of other open-ended questions. Do you reread, lots of other choice questions rather. Do you reread more if it's digital or if it's hard copy? Do you remember more if it's digital or hard copy, and so forth? So I began the studies in 2010. I did another version 2011, and they had a 3rd version in spring 2013. I am now collecting data from Japan and from Germany. The Japanese data are now accounted for, and I'll give you some results in a minute, in terms of the choice questions, the open-ended questions, what do you like most, what do you like least about digital and hard copy. I'm just now having translated. I'm delighted that my colleague Joachim Höflich, who is sitting in our midst quite literally, in the middle, is working with his students to gather data from Germany. I now have 17 responses that we got during the summer. I'll share those responses with you. I don't have the open-ended questions yet, but that's a work in progress. Okay, so the appeal of words on the screen. And I'll talk about 4 variables briefly. There are two clear advantages. They're convenient, no question about it. And we'll look at that in a moment. And there's a democratization of access. You can get things available to people that you couldn't have otherwise because of the digital media. Then there are the questions of, everyone thinks these are advantages, but maybe they're not. Digital screens are environmentally friendly. Okay, this audience, I do not have to say, there's a question mark there too, as well as there's a cost issue, and it's not clear that what is the better savings. There's been studies done in the States, and if you buy a used hard copy, you are going to have less of an expense than if you buy a digital book. Okay, the convenience issue. Study I did in 2011, 48% of the subjects, I had about 82 subjects that year, said the one thing they liked most about reading on screen involved convenience. It's easy to take with me. It's a hassle to carry around a lot of books. So I'll just mention that one of the things that I've done that I think is different from the study some of you all have done is to quantify my data. So I have a coding system for what do you like most, what do you like least about each of the media, and I'm able to calculate percentages on them. Okay. Some of you know the organization Goodreads, which started as a social reading platform. It's now going gangbusters. They did a survey of 1,500 of their members, 72% of whom read ebooks on their mobile phones while commuting or waiting in line. It's a convenience factor. I read the New York Times on my phone when I'm waiting at an airport. 13% said mobile phones were the only device they used for reading. So clearly a lot of people are reading conveniently on mobile devices. Democratization of access, which none of my students mentioned, but it's an important issue. There are Creative Commons licenses. There's the Public Library of Science, which has been a wonderful boon to online publication and open access publication. There are MOOCs. There's a new Digital Public Library of America, which just launched a couple of months ago. There are other digital libraries around the world which are being added, are connected to the website. And then there are lots of free e-readers and e-books that are being given away to children, particularly in Africa and in India. So, clear advantages. I'll go really quickly through the environmentally friendly because you all know the data. There's this assumption, particularly among university students, at least in the United States, that you're being really smart and environmentally friendly. Books kill trees. Okay, enough on that. I'll just jump down to my data. When I asked, what is the one thing you like most about reading on a digital device? 21% of the students said something about the environment. And this has been true over the 3 years that I've been doing the study. But then when I had this extra space, anything else you want to add, any comments? I would get things like, I like the digital screen safe paper, but it's hard to concentrate when reading on them. So there was a real love-hate relationship that they wanted to express. They wanted to say, I'm doing the right thing, but I'm not learning as much. Okay, the cost issues. There have been lots of price wars over the cost of ebooks, and it's fun to watch them happen. When Indiana University and these other institutions that have been developing initiatives for ebooks asked students, what do you like most about reading e-text, meaning e-text books? They said the cost. Well, I'm sure they said the cost, because these were experiments, and the books to them were free. The project pays for it. But the assumption was that these are going to be less expensive. However, as I just mentioned, used books are generally less expensive, plus you own them. And then I asked a question on the surveys that I did this spring, and that we're doing in Japan, and that we did in Japan, and we're just now doing in Germany. I said, if the cost of an ebook and a printed book were the same, what would you prefer for schoolwork? And the figures speak for themselves. Almost 90% in the United States said they preferred print. Japan, which is a little bit of a funny situation because an awful lot of work is done on cell phones or keitai that's not done in other parts of the world. 77% preferred print. Heck, that's still over 50. In Germany, the 17 students that responded, 94% of them preferred hard copy, if the price were the same. Okay, other kinds of responses. If you asked in general for doing academic reading, what would you prefer? And academic reading could be light stuff, it could be serious stuff. It was overwhelming overwhelmingly prefer print. When I asked about reading for pleasure, it was overwhelmingly preferring print. Okay. I asked some questions about, so how many of you sell your textbooks back if you have purchased them at the end of the term? And 61% sold at least some of their books back. I asked how many people annotate their books, because with the renting a printed book, you're allowed to annotate neatly, but you may annotate. 48% occasionally or never annotated. That is, there's this notion of I'm not keeping this, I'm just passing through, or the book is just passing through, whether digitally or in print. And the attitude is that books, whichever form they take, are ephemeral, which is a strange notion for a book. Okay, more rereading done when you were reading in hard copy. Text length I've already mentioned, but I'll give you some statistics. In the United States, if you have a longer text, 92% said they'd rather read in hard copy. For the shorter text, it was sort of split, which is interesting because we keep trying to tell students, I need to get the e-text of this, and we don't anticipate you're going to print it out. But when you ask them, what would you prefer? They tell us if it's long, I'd rather print it out. I'd rather have the hard copy. And I'll just mention that we're getting similar kinds of data for Japan, where there are 119 subjects, and Germany, my famous 17. Okay. Other kinds of responses. Memory. Do you remember more when you read in hard copy than you read in print or on digital media, or vice versa? 51% said they remembered more than they read in hard copy, something to do so. Distraction or concentration, two ways of asking the same question. When I asked, is it easier to concentrate when you're reading in hard copy or on a screen, 92% of the American subjects said it's easier to concentrate in hard copy. Okay. Japan, same number. Germany, again, it's 17 students, but very much the same trend. Then I asked about multitasking. Do you never, sometimes, very often, and so forth, multitask when you are reading on a screen or reading in hard copy? Reading in hard copy, 25% I said I do some multitasking, and that could involve talking with someone else. In fact, in Germany, for those responses I'm getting, it's multitasking is talking with someone else when I'm reading in hard copy. In the United States, it's probably eating and listening to music. When reading on a screen, 85% are multitasking. We know a lot about multitasking. It is not the best way to concentrate. Okay, what do you like most about reading on a screen? Easy to look up information. I can multitask when I read. Yeah. Okay, what do you like least? I get distracted. I don't absorb as much. What do you like most about reading in print? I can write on the pages and remember the material more easily. What do you like least about reading the print? Control F. The find function doesn't work in hard copy. And then my all-time favorite, it takes me longer because I read more carefully. That's what they like least about reading in print. They have to read. Okay, multitasking, addiction, distraction. What does the literature say? There's a lot that's been written on multitasking. It's pretty clear there are some central processing bottlenecks, and we know this from a lot of neuroimaging studies that have been done. We also know that no matter how good people say they are at doing what I call cognitive multitasking, that is doing two cognitive tasks, either simultaneously or seriatim, very, very few people are good. A few are, but relatively few. The Kaiser Family Foundation, which does a lot of research on media issues because they're worried about people's health, find that high school students, which is the group they most recently studied, have a very high level of multitasking when they're reading. We all know about how wonderful brain plasticity is. 50 years ago, who knew there was brain plasticity? Isn't it great? We're all going to learn how to be great multitaskers. Probably not. There's some things we may get better at. Playing computer games probably does have some advantages, but it's not clear we're going to be great multitaskers. There's also a lot we know, growingly, unfortunately, about internet addiction, which also goes to phone addiction. That is, it's a danger. And Korea is one of the countries that really has found out what a danger it is. In fact, there are centers for internet addiction. You take youths away for some number of of weeks or months, and you say, we have to break you of this habit. It's almost like breaking a heroin habit. The Korean conundrum is Korea has been very intensive in its use of mobile devices, particularly mobile phones, beginning at least 7 or 8 years ago. And they made a decision that we're going to switch all the textbooks in school to digital textbooks. And then they found out, but wait a second, our students are getting addicted. This is not good. So they have dialed back and are trying to decide really as we speak how much they should go to digital technologies for learning, because they know some of the consequences of using the technologies. Okay, some other issues with reading. I think it can fairly be observed that the ways we are reading on screen, the amount we're reading on the screen, is reshaping the way we write. A very simple example, and that increasingly we're not reading continuously, we're reading more on the prowl. A good example of this is the newspaper USA Today, which a couple of months ago redesigned the way it looks. And how does it look now? It looks more like web pages than it does continuous text. We also have seen a lot of the things being published are in much shorter formats than they used to be. So there's an explosion of, for example, Kindle singles, which are much shorter. There's a company called, in fact, there are many, many companies that say, a little bit to read. I know you don't have much time, and you're going to read it digitally. So we don't want you to have to read too much. There's a new company called Snap Reads, which advertises, you can look them up, which says they are perfect for, their readings are perfect for your lunch break, your commute, or right before bed. So again, it's changing the notion of how much you should be reading. If you look at what academic presses in the United States are doing, they are increasingly looking to downsize from a standard monograph, which is somewhere around 80,000, 100,000, maybe 120,000 words, to something closer to 40 or 50,000. And they're looking to put together, some of them are called shorts, some of them are called briefs, but they're shorter documents in the hope that people will buy them and maybe read them, because they're not going to read a whole book. One-off reading. One of the things I think is pretty clear is that digital media are encouraging one-off reading. Now, some of the things, meaning you read it once and don't read it again. Some of the things we read once and we don't read again anyway. So it doesn't matter, I would argue, what medium you read it on. It's your choice. But if you want people to reread things next week, next month, later in life, then if you're going digital, you are basically mitigating against the probability people will read things again. And there's some beautiful books written on why rereading is worth doing. And then there is what I call the death of the print button. I'm doing research on a book. It's called Words on Screen, The Fate of Reading in the Digital World. And there are a lot of things I see that I want to make a copy of, because I'm doing research, right? I want to underline, I want to file, I want to come back to. But there's no way to print. I can send the article to someone, I can like it, I can put it on Facebook, I can pin it, I can't print it. So I have all these print screens that are a ridiculous way to try to take things from offline. The number of things you cannot print. It's not a copyright issue, it's not I'm going to steal it. It's why bother? Who's going to print it? Well, me, thank you. Okay, other issues. Social reading. There's a wonderful little book written by Marcel Proust. Originally in French, I read it in English though, called On Reading, written a little more than a century ago. And he describes what he thinks reading is about. Namely, it's a conversation between an author and a reader. And it's a conversation that should take place between the two of you, even before you talk with anyone else about the book, because, so says Proust, you need to develop your own understanding, your own perspective, your own take on what this book is about before you can meaningfully have a conversation with someone else. Going across the Atlantic to Mortimer Adler, who was at the University of Chicago, he wrote a book called How to Read a Book, which was very well known in its time. And I went back and I read it in preparing for my book. And what he argues is something very similar. Namely, the reader has to engage with the text. And he says at the end of every page, you need to be able to write something down in the book or in a separate notebook about how you're interacting, what you're thinking about, what you're agreeing with, what you're disagreeing with, so you become a person in a dialogue with the author. However, with the explosive growth, and it really is explosive, of social reading, at least within the United States and somewhat internationally, there's the assumption that the way to interact with the book is by talking with somebody else. And yes, I know there have been book clubs for many, many years, but the change here that's taking place is saying your basic encounter is with other people, not at least first and foremost with the author. Okay, the physical side of reading I don't have to talk much about because we know so much about. There's this notion of what is ephemeral, if it's on screen as opposed to durable, and what do people like most about print. It's that, in terms of my studies, it's that tactile interaction with reading material that counts. Educational consequences. Okay, briefly. The more that things go online, whether they are courses or textbooks associated with the courses, the more we favor particular modes of reading. We favor search, we favor hyperreading over deep reading. We favor short over long texts. We favor one-off reading over rereading or over annotating. The cost savings are often valued over the potential for learning. So we have these initiatives in the United States. They want to save students money. I applaud that. What are the students learning? Well, there have been some studies done, and it's not quite clear. The graduate students in these experiments are saying, I don't learn as much. The undergraduates, it's not clear. They go sort of hot and cold. Okay, so there's some also shifting attitudes towards the value of the durable written word. And what we're doing, I'm suggesting, is redefining what we mean by written culture. Written culture was that which you could hold in your hand, you could come back to, you could reread, you could form a relationship with. If our notion of reading, because it's still writing on the screen, and this is a screen, this is writing, I'm reading it. But it's a very different kind of relationship we have. Psychological consequences, distraction and concentration. It's very clear that these devices make it difficult for us to focus all of our attention if we have any chance of internet connection. And I hear this from country to country. I hear this from device to device. The haptics of reading. I won't go through the details because, again, you folks know more than I, or we know an equal amount. There's a question of the durability of our memory for what we're reading. And there's a loss of what I call the stumble upon opportunity. So I haven't looked at a book for 10 years. It's in my shelf. I'm about to move from one office to another. I'm packing the book, and I said, wow, I hadn't thought about you for a long time. But I wouldn't do that if it were stored on my digital device. I see it, I come upon it. Sometimes it's on the floor and I literally kick it, and I stumble upon it. Okay, there's the psychological value of print. And one of the things that is talked about a lot in the United States is that print will continue to exist, but it will have boutique value. We will have beautifully printed coffee table books, but very little that we care about in print for everyday reading. Another kind of challenge is as the prices of ebooks fall, there's a lot of question of, well, if I didn't pay much for it, it can't be worth very much. So what is the value of authorship? When you look at the whole question of blogs, and people can post anything they want online, and they can be independent authors and so forth, but you get no money and you don't have to pay any money. So was this worth reading? There are highbrow magazines in the United States like Atlantic and Harper's that say we have paywalls because we want you to know the text matters. Our authors matter. They think about their language. And if it were all free and giveaway, you wouldn't value their language as much. Whether that's true or not, it's a clear perception. Okay, challenges of ebooks to the notion of what it means to read. We've talked about some of this. What I'm basically saying is reading is designed increasingly to be done in this network fashion. 2 minutes? 1 minute? No minutes? 1 minute. Okay. And these devices are not going away anytime soon. So what do we have to figure out? We have to figure out how we can meaningfully, in the United States we say how the cowboys and the farmers can be friends, how we can take these two different ways of doing things and make the best use of both of them. So I'm going to suggest we have to think this through rather than just hope it's going to happen. We have to make room for both kinds of technologies. We have to teach students how to read without distraction if they're reading on a screen. No, I do not have the solution, but I think we have to deal with the issue. We have to foster respect for print. And we have to model not using digital devices in instances where we shouldn't be, and Americans are particularly bad at this. Other recommendations: do not give up on long readings. Don't say, well, they're not going to read it anyway, I'll give them a short reading. We have to teach students about what the truth is regarding environmental issues and costs of digital versus paper. And we also have to, I'm suggesting, not assume, well, the students are using all this digital stuff, therefore that's how we have to teach. This is a very American attitude that I fight tooth and nail. Reading itself evolves with time, there's no question about it. And I have no problems with reading continuing to evolve, but I think we have to think through where we would like it to go. Because there are implications for intellectual development, there are intellectual issues for our personal well-being, and there are issues for our notion of shared culture. Thank you very much.